Hey, friends, welcome back for another episode for this series on becoming a future ready church for Exponential Next. In this episode, we're going to discuss another shift that we think will help churches move toward a better future. We're talking about the shift from racial tension to community blessing. Now, behind that shift is the question, why do churches need diversity beyond tokenism? During the 90s and up to the 2000s, even during that time, churches tended to be of one predominant race or ethnicity. But currently, over the last decade to 2 decades, a heightened awareness and appreciation for racial diversity led to more diverse congregations. In fact, younger generations often feel that something must be wrong if a congregation isn't intentionally diverse. As we move into the future, the role of race and ethnicity will become strongly linked to how God will use the gospel to bless every tribe and language and people and nation, Revelations 5:9. But as we'll discuss here on this episode, tokenism will almost always work against meaningful diversity and vision. Thanks again for joining us. My name is Daniel Yang, National Director of Churches of Welcome at World Relief.
And I'm Warren Bird, Senior Vice President of Research at ECFA, the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability. And I'm also the author or co-author of 35 books for church leaders.
And I'm Adelle Banks, a veteran religion journalist. I'm the projects editor and a national reporter at Religion News Service.
And together we wrote a book, Becoming a Future Ready Church, 8 Shifts to Encourage and Empower the Next Generation of Leaders, released by Zondervan in October 2024.
It has been widely reported that the United States has diversified at a rapid rate, especially since the late 1970s and early 1980s. For our context, our book includes statistics about racial composition in the United States in 1980, when, say, Rick Warren and Kay Warren started Saddleback Church, and we compare that to the latest census data. By 2045, the census predicts, America will have no majority race. Whites, for the first time, make up less than half of the nation, will make up less than half of the nation's population. Daniel, what have some scholars noted about how the church has or has not adapted to these numbers?
Yeah, one of the watershed books on this topic, Divided by Faith, came out in 2000 by Michael Emerson and Christian Smith. And it really was a big part of launching a multi-ethnic church movement. That wasn't to say that multi-ethnic churches didn't exist before then. They did indeed. But in terms of like the awareness for the intentionality, church networks using that term, one of the major things that they had found in their research was that churches still were vastly one of the most segregated institutions when compared to other American institutions. But after 2 decades of like this intentional effort, scholars like Corey Little Edwards reminded us that even this valiant effort for 20 plus years to make multi-ethnic churches a phenomena, and not just a phenomena, but a norm. She talked about how there are some shortcomings in her article she wrote for Christianity Today. The multi-ethnic church hasn't lived up to its promise. And her basic premise was that we had still continued to perpetuate some of the tensions or avoided some of the racial conversations. Even though congregations were racially diversifying, we hadn't really talked about some of the elephants in the room, like racial injustice and dealing with the ills in society. And so, but I also think that's a part of the maturation process in this conversation. We do have to go beyond seeing racial diversity as just a utility. It definitely shouldn't be a commodity to be marketed or consumed. It's about something bigger than that. And churches are realizing that. It's about Revelation 7:19 through 17. It's seeing the nations coming to Jesus and being blessed. And this is a reminder that multi-ethnicity isn't just about racial quotas in the church. It's about God's people fulfilling his vision of seeing all nations blessed and justice established.
The work of the scholars that Daniel just mentioned and others show that diversity is meaningful for today's congregations only if there is true belonging and equity for those in the minority of the congregation. Our book, Becoming a Future Ready Church, breaks down how racial and ethnic tokenism can preserve majority dominance even unintentionally. It also includes a chart we hope will be helpful that defines the terms that are used, but not always understood in relation to the church. Terms like diverse, multicultural, multiracial, and multi-ethnic. Our Future Ready book also includes a profile of a church that achieved a meaningful and natural diversity through reflecting its already diverse surrounding community. Adelle, can you share about that story that you interviewed and crafted?
Yes, Warren, thank you. I had the opportunity to interview the Reverend Charles O. Galbraith about the Alliance Tabernacle, a Brooklyn, New York church that has lived through a number of neighborhood changes. The church started more than a century ago as a result of a tent revival in the Crown Heights and Bedford-Stuyvesant area of that borough of New York. But as the area became a thriving African American community, the church relocated and had a predominantly Italian and Irish congregation in East Flatbush, a neighborhood predominated by those demographics. But by the 1970s, another change came to that area with an influx of people from the Caribbean islands. The congregation has come to have members representing some 26 nations. But Galbraith said even though there is an overwhelming Black population, there some 92%, he felt a call to reach those who comprise the minority in his community. Through trial and error, the church has developed a separate campus, intentionally seeking for it to look different from the multicultural, but mostly Caribbean congregation that started it. This other location has represented another kind of diversity with a mix of Latino, white, and Caribbean people. It not only looks different because of its size and racial ethnic makeup, but because of activities held there. Sometimes there has been a gathering of dinner church, a movement where attendees share food and faith. And at that time and others, there is a greater openness to people to ask questions and have dialogue as they gather. This is an instance where a predominantly Black church has worked to foster what Galbraith calls, quote unquote, intentional mentoring of identity, end quote. Whether the fellowship it has started includes people who are Dominican, Cuban, or Iowan. Galbraith said he encourages other congregations to consider making such shifts where they can. He said, quote, if you do see demographic shifts and changes, I believe that this is part of our ethic to ask how do we empower, engage, and allow all to be a part of God's kingdom.
Thanks, Adelle. Wow, I love those stories. Charles Galbraith is an example of the kind of shift Becoming a Future Ready Church is recommending for people to go from asking, how can we help minorities feel more included in our church, shifting to instead ask, how can our church push the boundaries of what it means to be ethnically inclusive and diverse? Daniel, what else might you want to add before we wrap up here?
Yeah, Warren, I do have some concluding thoughts. I thought it'd be fun, though, Warren, you do know Charles Galbraith, you know the role of his church in your denomination. I'd be curious to hear you share a little bit more about how important their church means to not just New York City, but to the movement of the churches that you're a part of, and what you think that signals for the future of the denomination, the Christian Missionary Alliance.
Wow, yeah. So I've got gray hair, and I go back to when this was a largely white congregation, and the previous pastor to Charles Galbraith took the very bold and somewhat controversial steps of saying, hey, our church needs to change with the neighborhood. And our neighborhood is becoming more diverse, and I not only want to lead the way in it becoming more diverse, but there will be a point where I need to step down as pastor and a person of color come and lead the congregation in its next chapter. So this has been a congregation that the Christian Missionary Alliance has watched carefully over the years. How has it changed and changed again? And Charles Galbraith has not only been very intentional about representing the community, but he then has wanted to become a beacon of light in the congregation, so that, for example, I think he's on the mayor's council for this, and the community where that church is a go-to spot and a beacon of light that not only impacts its community for Christ, but now to your point, Daniel, other churches in our denomination and beyond look to it and say, oh, that's how to do diversity well. That's how to have the racial and ethnic sensitivities that are needed. It's been powerful, inspiring. And yes, as we were brainstorming about the book, I said, okay, I know the story that we need for this particular chapter. And of course, Adelle, you did a great job in digging through it. And then knowing the Hispanic woman who's leading the initiatives for this kind of separate fellowship group that may become a congregation on its own has been really fun to watch.
Yeah, so good. I know so much of the conversation can tend to feel like, especially the scholarship, looking at the demographic shifts in America, and the scale seems so big and so vast, and you can't ignore those large trends. I think so much of our work is to alert church leaders like you to these national trends, changing demographics, changing cultural attitudes, those kinds of things, super important things. But when it comes to the discourse on diversity, those things are best developed in the local context, just as you heard through the story. And it's most effective in the immediate communities surrounding the church. To say it a different way, back in the 60s and 70s, when it was difficult to have these conversations and it was easier to sort of like continue on in segregation or to kind of leave a changing neighborhood, there was less of an intentional effort to try to figure these conversations out locally. And now we're at a point now where you can't move to the suburbs and find homogeneity because diversity is in the suburbs. You can't move to the rural parts of America because there's diversity there as well. And so you have to stick it out and figure out what meaningful diversity means in a local context. And the reality is that for most of our churches, they can only be meaningfully diverse as much as there is as meaningful diversity happens in our personal lives. We can only have diversity in our churches in as far as we're having diversity in our dinner at our dinner tables. And there's this idea that scholars write about. It's called commensality. Seems like a really big word. But as we're ending our conversation here, I want to give us one food for thought as we wrap up. And this idea of commensality is really that we are changed by those we eat together with. We're changed by those that we share meals with. And it seems like a very basic idea, but you think about those that you eat with the most, whether it's breakfast in the morning with perhaps your spouse or your children, or the coworkers that you're having lunch with, or the friends and family members that you invite to dinner, either on the weekend or any given night of the week. And with the regularity that you're having these encounters with, and you're not only having meals, but you're developing meals, and there's story behind the meals, you realize that over time your life is being changed by those that you share meals with. And you see this throughout scripture. As a matter of fact, Jesus does most of his discipleship, or a lot of his discipleship, around meals. And a lot of his teaching happens around meals. And then even one of the greatest tensions, the greatest conflicts that we see happen in scripture happen around a meal, when the disciples who had already reached Gentile communities decided that, you know what, we're actually going to stop eating with Gentiles. And the Judaizers came in and reconvinced them to just have meals with the Jews. And that's when Paul rebuked Peter and reminded him that the gospel tore down those racial ethnic tensions. And again, these things happened around meals. And it's a reminder for us that at the end of the day, we could talk about demographic shifts. We could talk about all that's happening across the nation. We could talk about some of the divides, but some of the greatest divisions are still within our homes. And this isn't to shame anybody. This is to say that our Gen Zers see this, and their tables are most diverse out of all generational cohorts that we've seen. And as we pay attention to how they're managing their dinner tables and they're managing their meals, it is an indicator for how the future tables in churches are going to look like. And so we urge you, and we also encourage you that this is a great adventure that churches are embarking on. And in the future, I think the term multi-ethnicity will just sort of dissipate, just like in the 60s and the 70s, the term integrated churches over time just dissipated because people just come to assume they're going to see this new reality. Thank you again for listening to our conversation. We hope that it's been helpful for you. We want to invite you back for our next episode on this series, Becoming a Future Ready Church. And we'll hope that you would check out some of the other episodes that you can find on Exponential's YouTube channel. Thanks again for joining us.
Take care, everyone.
We look forward to seeing you next time.